Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this last, I think it's the last session for the faculty in tra- training sessions from COITAB. Welcome to this session, and this morning we have Dr. Troy Brown, who is a member of the Faculty of Education and Humanities. Dr. Troy Brown, over to you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Besessa, for your warm words of introduction. I also want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to present on this platform on a very important, critical, timely, qualitative approach that I know many of us probably would have read about and maybe would have tried it on one or numerous occasions. So once again, I just want to say thank you and congratulations on all the great work you are doing in your department. Good afternoon once again, colleagues, all of my colleagues, my friends, students who are in the master's program as well as the PhD program. I want to welcome you to the qualitative approach, grounded theory. Okay, and I don't intend to be talking to you all the time. I prefer to make my presentation in the first 2/3 of the time allotted to me, which is 90 minutes, and have us interact through questions and answer session where you can probably ask your specific questions and I'll be able to respond to those questions so that you can have a greater understanding of this approach. So I'm going to pause towards the first hour, the hour mark, and engage your questionings. This afternoon, we have a few objectives. The first one, we want to define the term grounded theory in our own words. Given a brief explanation, we also want to identify at least one research problem in which grounded theory can be used. And finally, we want to explore the phases the researcher is encouraged to go through when analyzing the information collected. Let me just pause to find out if you're hearing me clearly.
Yes, we are.
Excellent. So this is what we will try to uncover as we go through our session here today. Now let us get ready. Are you ready? Well, let's go. I want to tell you the truth. I will present to you 4 statements and ask you to identify the statement that is true. There are 3 false ones and only 1 true one. So you will tell me which one you believe is true. I'll read the first. Grounded theory is about generating hypotheses. Don't answer yet. Wait until I complete the 4th one. 2. One criterion for conducting a grounded theory research is that the majority of respondents must have experienced the phenomenon of interest. 3. Grounded theory research is a quantitative methodology. Finally, grounded theory research is not about creating explanations based on the data collected. Those are my 4 statements. Which one is truth? Let me hear 2 responses. Okay, I see the chat is lighting up. Number 1 is truth. Okay, 1 person. Anyone else? Okay, no one wants to try. Okay, we have to go. Number one is indeed the truth one, the true one. Grounded theory is about generating hypotheses. What is qualitative research? Qualitative research is any kind of research that produces findings not based on quantified analyses. And this does not rule out that some of the data that you will collect from the field would be numerical. It doesn't rule out that fact. Even though we're talking here about a qualitative research and a more specific approach, grounded theory, when we collect the information from the field, we can collect numerical data. However, look at the first part of the definition here. Okay, it's a kind of research that produces findings that are not based on quantified analyses. Now, since we're heading into grounded theory, I figure that we should start from the broader orientation, which is the qualitative orientation. All right. And so now we are heading into the grounded theory approach. Now, grounded theory is a qualitative research design in which the researcher generates, which is the researcher develops a hypothesis, or hypotheses, where they also generate explanations, or we can say theories, of a process, an action, or an interaction, all shaped by the views of the respondents. So here we have all the views of the respondents, and now the researcher is poised to generate a theory, or we can say explanation or hypothesis. Okay? It uses a set of systematic procedures to develop an inductively derived theory that is what? That is now grounded in the data collected from our respondents. So I highlighted systematic procedures, and we're going to see what is that sequence or process we must go through in order to identify this approach as grounded theory. Struss and Corbin, 1990, said, grounded theory is a scientific methodology. I'm going to pause there. Let it sink in. Because it all depends on the way we were oriented, that we may find this statement problematic. Hence the reason why I actually made this citation. Because I want us to understand, yes, grounded theory is indeed a scientific approach. And we're going to see what the science is. I remember when I, probably my first semester at college, the question was asked, is teaching, and we all know that familiar question, okay? We all know that familiar question. Is teaching a what? An art, or is it a science? When I was preparing, doing my reading, it dawned on me, the question that was asked way back then. Now, it is very important that we pay keen attention to our research questions. And you may ask me the question, why deal with research question now when I was given the task to talk about grounded theory? And this is the reason. Our research questions determine to a large extent the research methodology. And this is a dilemma not only for the seasoned or the novice researchers, but also for the seasoned ones. Which one comes first? The chicken or the egg, so to speak? Does the research question inform the method, or the method informs the research question? And sometimes to respond to this question, our orientation actually blinds us. Orientation means in which orientation, or let me just use back that word, with methodology, we were actually trained in. And sometimes the methodology that we are trained to use at our universities, different universities, sometimes blind us. And that can be one of our greatest challenges. The rule of thumb. Your research questions will inform your choice of methodology. The grounded theory research questions that GTRQs tend to be oriented towards what? Towards process, towards actions, towards interactions. So when you are writing your research questions for the grounded theory, it is more oriented toward these. Process, not relationship. Process, or the interaction or the actions of people or the interactions of a particular group. That's what you're studying. So when you're talking, when the idea of process is coming through, it gives us that tick in our minds that, listen, I'm probably heading down towards grounded theory. Let us look for a bit at testing versus generating. With the grounded theory, rather than doing what? Rather than testing the hypothesis, the researcher seeks to generate a hypothesis. Now, the researcher's goal is to explain. The researcher's goal is to generate, to discover the phenomena in light of the theoretical framework. And sometime later, another presenter can look at what goes into the headings that go into your research document, and what type of heading is best fitted within a particular orientation. When I talk about orientation, I'm talking about the quantitative study or the qualitative study. Okay, because sometimes it can be confusing. All right, when do we use grounded theory? When you need a broad theory of explanation of a process, I just said that, action or interaction, this theory must not be taken off of the shelf or from a book that will lack creativity, but only from the data that is collected. Hence the reason your theory must be grounded in the data that is collected. When you wish to study a process, actions of people, or the interactions of persons, when a theory is not available to explain a process, when a theory does not adequately explain a process, when a theory was developed from a sample outside of the researcher's interest. So if you are keen, or if you really want to study the process or to develop a theory, these are some guidelines in which you can observe. Sampling and participants. One, we talk about purposive sampling or theoretical sampling. Now, this is not unique to grounded theory, okay? All the respondents, and this is what I want to emphasize, it came under my tell you the truth lineup. Not most of your participants, but all of your participants must have been impacted by the phenomenon of interest, all of them, because you're trying to generate a theory from the participants. Hence the reason why a random selection cannot be used here. Because sometimes you can randomly select an individual that was never impacted by the phenomenon of interest. So what would that respondent share with you? It is not about numbers. Again, this is not unique to grounded theory. However, Creswell 2013 is saying, listen, if you're really looking for a substantive theory, and he advised, why not use about 20 to 30 individuals, respondents? That is his suggestion, okay? Now, again, researchers must endeavor to reach a point of saturation. And again, Creswell is suggesting these number of interviews, 20 to 60 interviews, whether they're individual or there are focus groups, 20 to 60 of them. And that is what he is suggesting, okay? Now here is where we go into the meat of it. And I want you to do a little bit research on some read up on the Struss and Glaser episode. Now, the Struss and Glaser episode gave rise to these three types of grounded theory. Because originally in 1967, Glaser and Struss, you know, they were creating a grounded theory methodology. But somewhere along the line, Struss, you know, decided to write against what he would have originally mentioned in his first research. And so there was a little fall away, a little breakup. And this is the conflict right in the corner there to my right of the screen, little conflict between Struss and Glaser. And so Struss linked up with Corbin, all right? And they decided here, our grounded theory research will be systematic. And so they would have written on the systematic grounded theory. Glaser continued with his emerging grounded theory. And then Chamaz came up and said, which one is correct? Is it a systematic grounded theory correct or the emerging grounded theory correct? Well, I will produce, or I will design my constructivist grounded theory. So, but today we will look specifically the systematic grounded theory. This design is widely used in educational research, and the reason is this. It is associated with the detailed, systematic, and rigorous procedure. Yes, I said scientific. Okay, we said that earlier. It emphasizes three phases of data analysis and a visual picture of the theory that was developed. Quickly again. Data collection sources, interviews, observations, document analysis. Again, these are not unique to grounded theory. But there's a reason why I place it here, because you are on the move to collect data from your participants or from your respondents. And here you have a mass of data in front of you. What do you do with it? What do you do that interview that you would have collected? Transcribe. And I remember conducting an interview for about 45 minutes, an interview, as a focus group interview. And it took me almost 3 hours to transcribe. So transcription is a time-consuming activity. Why? Because you would like to capture everything that your respondents are saying. If you're going to use a tape, let them know, take into consideration the ethics of recording. So you just ask permission before it is recorded and so forth, which will help you to play and play back and play back again until you get it right. Okay. Now, is it necessary to transcribe all your interviews or field notes? That's a good question. Is it necessary to do that? I'm going to answer it in a while. What do you think? The rule of thumb is to transcribe only as much as is needed. What is going through your mind? I know your eyes are wide open because I just said that. And you will have a multiplicity of questions to ask me. Only transcribe what is needed. But the big question is, how do you know how much is needed? I know that would have been your question. That's why I placed it in the PowerPoint. How much is really needed? As a result, what would be the most prudent thing to do? Since you may never know, especially at the beginning of your data collection, how much is needed. What would you do? What would I do? I'll transcribe everything to avoid unnecessary delay. That is what I will do. But what will you do? Alternatively, remember I said what I will do, transcribe everything to avoid unnecessary delay, lest I leave out a very important part of my data collection. Alternatively, transcribe and analyze entirely in detail your beginning interviews and field notes, everything, before attending to the others. So you have a multiple of field notes here. You have a multiple of interviews here. This point is saying, listen, relax on your collection. Analyze all that I have here before going back into the field. And it must not be one or two. Use your own judgment. Should not be 1 or 2, 3, 4. Use your judgment, because you're heading towards a point of saturation. And I'm asking, as researchers, here is where your judgment comes in. Analyze all of them before anything else. Now, that does something for you. The early coding and analysis give guidance to the next field observation and interviews, because it now guides you as to what you will transcribe, because you're now looking at the trend of the set that you would have collected. And now you may say, all right, after analyzing this first part, I'm not going to transcribe this one here because the frequency of it, may not be so high as what I already have. And then you would read something else and you say, let me transcribe this, because guess what? It aligns perfectly with what I have analyzed already. But let me tell you something. It comes with great practice. Not even the seasoned ones might engage in this. Okay, so if you're a beginning researcher, please, I would advise you, humbly advise you, to transcribe all that you have. Okay, because sometimes the challenge is really how much is how much, So when you would have analyzed this first set and it guides you into, which ones you will analyze now, since you now have a good idea as to what is emerging within your data collection. So at this point, you can be selective. When I read another interview, you can say, okay, this doesn't really line up with, but so I can rest this aside. And then you read a second one. This one lines up, perfectly with the themes that have, or the categories, or the themes that are emerging gradually within the data that I would have already collected. Now, later, as your theory develops, you may wish to listen to the tapes and transcribe only the sentences. So you're now going back to those that you probably did not transcribe in the first place, and just listen to them. And you may only transcribe maybe a paragraph there, or you may transcribe, a little passage or a sentence and so forth. But you will not be engaged in transcribing the entire thing. That's the point I'm making. Data analysis and coding. A code is a word or phrase used to describe a line, a sentence, a paragraph of a transcribed data collected. So you see how important this transcription is. Okay. Researchers can use in vivo codes or a word or phrase from a technical literature. You can have a minimum of 25 to 30 codes, and this is also according to Creswell 2013. The in vivo code is a word or a phrase used directly by the respondents. Okay, that's the one I love to use as well. Rather than selecting, technical term based on what the students or the participants or the respondents would have mentioned. I love to go back into what they would have said, so I get a clearer understanding of the document or the information that I would have received. Coding represents the operations by which data are broken down, conceptualized and put back together in new and novel ways. Coding. Noticed. It has to be what? Conceptualized. And this is the central process by which theories are generated or developed from the data collected. Coding helps the researcher to acquire rich, thick description. Rich must be mass understanding, great understanding, great details of what the participants or the respondents are saying. And the only way in the systematic grounded theory that you can have this rich and thick description is through your coding. It enables the researcher to dive deep, diving, go deep into what the participants are saying. If you do not understand what the participants are saying, you go back to them. In another presentation, we can talk more of member checking and reliability and validity of it and so on, going back to your participants to have a clear understanding, and then come back to your document and you continue the process. I remember going back to my group, my participants, and say, you know, I heard you say it, but could you go a little deeper for me? Help me understand what you have said to me earlier. Member checking. And that helps you with the understanding of the data that you have collected. And there are three major coding phases. 1, open coding. 2, axial coding. And 3, selective coding. Open coding. This is the first phase in the coding paradigm. And you are coding to extract major categories of information. That's the reason why you're coding. It is a guide towards the themes that will come out in your later chapters. One of these days, we will go into how the themes are actually generated. It should be in the not too distant future. And you can also recognize that by using one of your softwares. That's another thing we can reserve for another time, where I show you, or some other presenter, show you how these softwares are used. I'm familiar with MaxQDA and QDA Miner. Those are the two that I would interface with, use on a regular basis. MaxQDA or QDA Miner 4.0, that's the last one I use. Now, when you are doing your open coding, be very careful with it. You can code line by line. You read each line and see if there's anything in that line that you want that jumps out at you. You can also read sentence by sentence and see what actually jumps out at you. Paragraph by paragraph and see what actually jumps out at you. And many of these softwares have the frequency that when you use them to code, it generates a frequency. This is an extract from my dissertation where I use the QDA Miner 4.0 to generate my open codes. The last column is my frequency counts. The center column are the exact words my respondents would have used. And then I look to see what is my initial codes. How can they actually, what is actually emerging as I go along? Okay, so look at the frequency. Some are 13, the highest one is 42, the lowest one is 1. They have 2, 3, 4, and so forth, and so forth. And these codes were divided into a total of 229 counts. Some of the categories and codes were merged for the clearer understanding of the analysis. So some of them were actually collapsed and the frequency count added only for those that came together. So now that you would have done your line by line coding, very important, that's the one I use, the line by line, because I want to capture everything the participants would have said. I now have a little understanding of my codes. From my open code, I go to my axial coding. From this open code phase, the axial coding emerges, in which the researcher identifies one open code that I have in parentheses, category or core phenomenon. Then he goes back to the data, that should be data, to identify subcategories around the category or core phenomenon. It is like a bicycle wheel, like an axle. So the axle is that one open code that the researcher selects. Then he goes back into the data and the rim, you know, as school-wise, we had bicycle, all of us know about riding bicycle and so on. So the rim at the edges, the circumference there, would be all the subcategories that are related to that main or that one open code. So this rectangularly looking box is very, very important for individuals who want to engage in grounded theory, because the relationship or the connection between the category and the subcategory is not just a mere connection. It is not just a mere relationship. And this point needs to be emphasized. Now, these relationships must be through some components, 5 of these components. A causal condition. So those subcategories must be related to this core category through some causal condition. I'm going to explain all of them. Through a context, through intervening conditions, strategies, all of these things are tied into the connection. And finally, we have consequences. All of them are related to them. So it is not just our students, more or less, master's students or PhD students, is not just looking for a mere relationship between that open code, that one open code, and those that are related to it. Other conditions, subcategories that influence the core category. Something must influence that. So look to see in those other codes if you have anything or any open codes that are related to the main one through some influence. Strategies, specific actions or interactions that result from the core phenomenon. If there's something resulting from, that is some form of string in connecting the two. The context, obviously, there's a context. The specific condition that influence the strategies. Look at the strategies. Is there an intervening condition? general contextual condition that influence the strategies. And we're going to see a diagram of how these are connected. And finally, I have this as my final point, the outcome of employing whatever strategies. I think I have it on probably the next slide. Yes. So, a little summary of the connectivity. We see that what? Causal conditions influence the what? Core phenomenon. The core phenomenon, the context, the intervening conditions influence the strategies, and the strategies influence the consequences. This is a diagram of what I just said. The context, core phenomenon, and the intervening conditions influencing the strategies here, and the strategies influencing the consequences, the end result. Again, this is an extract from my dissertation, where I was able to see that type of relationship or that connection between that core and the subcategories. I should have told you my title, Teacher Qualification Characteristics and Secondary School Students' Mathematics Achievement, a Convergent Parallel Mixed Method. So my methodology was actually a mixed, you know, and for my qualitative arm, I use the grounded theory as in my qualitative arm. So here I was able to show that level of connectivity. With my intervening conditions, my causal conditions, my core, I decided to put a core in the middle, you know, the strategies leading to my consequences, my end result. One of my consequences that I'm looking for is that prepare students for life, addressing students' specific issues through academic coaching, because that was one of my teacher qualification characteristics that I examined or explored, and maximizing students' mathematical success through teacher mathematical experience. That was another of my teacher qualification characteristics. Open coding, axial coding, leading to my selective coding. Selective coding is the final phase of the coding paradigm. We get that. During the axial coding phase, researchers developed the basis for selective coding. What the researchers should be doing at this stage here of the axial coding is to begin looking for relationships, looking for connections between what? Between my major categories. At the end, and I put end in uplifted commas, you know, sometimes you don't even talk of the end in qualitative research, because you can always go back. Iterative process, that's what Chris will talk about. You can use back and forth. So hence the reason why I put end, you know, in uplifted commas. At the end of the axial phase, the researcher now has categories that are rich and thick. At this point, in order to consolidate the relationship, the connections, the researcher moves between inductive, deductive thinking. That's what I just mentioned to you. Back and forth, back and forth. Creswell talks about the iterative process. You know, you ask yourself questions, you generate. You ask yourself more questions, you generate hypotheses, you make comparisons, and you move back and forth. Why are you doing that? Because you would like to ensure that what you have collected is rich and is thick. And the theory generation is done at this final phase. Validating the theory against the data collected completes the grounding. And this theory can be presented in about 3 ways. One, visual coding paradigm. That's how you can actually present your theory. Secondly, a series of hypotheses. And thirdly, through a narrative form. Again, from my dissertation, at the selective coding phase, the grounded theory identified is the theory merged from the qualitative strand of this research, and I must mention the qualitative strand of this research because my research was a mixed convergent parallel mixed method, has advanced one's understanding of the TQCs, the teacher qualification characteristics, and how students' academic achievement at CSEC mathematics examination can be improved. After a careful and systematic analysis, which would have told you that I would have utilized the systematic grounded theory within my dissertation. And that theory is mathematical mastery maximization. Okay, and you can extend that a little bit. Mathematical mastery maximization is not vacuous, it hinges on teacher qualification characteristics, since my research was actually based on that. Now, remember I said to you earlier that you have various ways in which you can actually represent your theory. I represented it 2 ways. In a statement, brief statement, hypothesis, as well as in a visual form. Now started with my teachers at grade 12, and in the second box here, I have CAQPE. You know, I should have extended the circular thing a little bit. There's an E, which stands for experience. These are the 5 teacher qualification characteristics that I looked at, and all the things that are connected, leading to my consequence. The last box there, the consequence that I would like to ensure or see or endeavor, if I should do any more research in this bit, that maximizing students' CSEC mathematics success is what I aimed to achieve. There's some challenges, obviously. I'm just going to go, there's a few challenges. Researchers must set aside their theoretical ideas or notions so that the analytic substantive theory can emerge. Don't bring your theory into it. Let the theory emerge itself. The researcher must recognize that this is a systematic approach to data analysis. The researcher faces the difficulty of determining when the categories are sufficiently saturated or when the theory is deeply detailed. That's the challenge you, I, we all as researchers will face in a qualitative endeavor. And this can be countered by using discriminant sampling, seeking out a different group of individuals to determine if the theory holds true for these additional participants. The researcher needs to recognize that the primary outcome of this research is a theory with specific components, and I identified the 5 components just a few slides previously. Generalizability, qualitative research. Yes, we do have generalizability. In grounded theory, we do have generalizability. However, be very careful. Don't take me to task just yet. The generalizability that we talk about would be either user or reader generalizability. The reader or the user generalizability. And this is the reason. It is not like the generalizability of the quantitative, where you do your random selection, and this sample adequately represents the population. So you can, generalize to that population. No, no, no. I'm not talking about that. Because the theory is close to the data. Because remember, the theory was generated based on the what? The data that is collected. It does not have wide applicability or scope. So be very careful. But the generalizability I'm talking about, the reader who uses or the consumer of my research can decide, okay, this researcher used the something that connects to my classroom or my district or my division, and I can probably use it because it relates to me. It relates to my classroom. So yes, that's the reader because he is or she is the consumer of my research. Thank you so very much for listening to that little bit of discussion, a talk. Now it is time for your questions. I don't know, Dr. Bissess, you're going to monitor the
Yes.
session. I'm not sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brown, for that very simplistic. To me, it was simple, it was clear explanation of grounded theory, introduction to grounded theory. There were aspects of it I particularly liked. And yes, we will open the floor to questions. You can raise your hands if you wish, or you can unmute and ask questions. I have a question, but I'm waiting to see if anybody else has questions. I do have a question, and just because you talked about open coding, right? And you mentioned that you do open coding, but do you do in open coding? Do you do both latent and semantic coding with the open coding, where you do line by line in vivo coding?
Yes. Yes. It is up to the researcher. What I like about the qualitative research is so flexible your coding level or your code. So you can go ahead and use those. However, Dr. said, the line by line ones, semantic, the line by line, it can help you to have that deeper or how you put it, the rounded understanding of what the participants are saying. So
then you would be looking at more latent meaning rather than semantic. As you say that, would you say that one predominates the other?
No, one doesn't predominate the other. It is just you, the researcher, what you decide. Now you can decide to go for line by line. You can decide to go for paragraph by paragraph. You can decide to go for sentence by sentence. It is all up to you. So I would not say here that one, is predominates the other one. It is just you as the researcher and maybe your level of orientation.
Okay, now you mentioned, I don't know if anybody has questions. I'm looking to see if there's a raised hand. You mentioned going back and forth with the data between inductive and deductive understanding of the data. Can you give an example of how you do this?
Okay. Take for example, I'm going to refer to my study. I would have generated a theory that says that mathematical mastery is not vacuous. It hinges on 5 teacher qualification characteristics. That's my theory. Now, I can go back and ask myself, is this really true? I go back to my data and I try to test it now. What did the students say? And I'm testing in my mind. Is it true that the mastery of mathematics hinge on teacher qualification characteristics? This is the testing part. This is the deductive part comes in. And then I come back and say, oh yeah, indeed, it hinges on teacher qualification characteristics. That's the inductive part, because we know that we can line up our inductive reasoning with the qualitative thing, and the deductive reasoning with actually testing of the hypotheses. So you have that deductive, that inductive back and forth runnings, let me put it, sorry to put it that way, in your mind, because, and the reason for that process is that your theory must be substantive. It must be as a result of a deep understanding of your data. So you can test your theory as it comes up. You don't have to write it down because that's a qualitative part. You don't have to write it down, but you can, or probably put it in your document. You can write it down somewhere and you're testing. Some persons may want, and what you can do too, some individuals, they can take that theory, or I can take my theory and actually perform a testing of the hypothesis that I would have created. That is another way I can move back and forth in my inductive and my deductive side of the research.
Thank you for that example. Can I ask a question? I'm not seeing anybody raising their hands, but I want to ask a question. You talk about going back and forth with it. Thank you, Mr. Williams. Let me ask this last question because it's linked to what he just said, and then I'll read out what you just said. You talk about going back and forth with the inductive and deductive, right? How do the constructs of, say, you're trying not to be subjective. So do you then, with the going back and forth, do you use bracketing, reflexivity, memoing, and journaling as part of that back and forth process?
Great, good.
Does it fit into that? I'm just
yes,
asking.
Yes. That's excellent. And you mentioned bracketing. That's perfect. You must engage in that part. And I think I didn't use the exact word bracketing, but I said leave the bias outside the door. Okay, that's what we refer to as the bracketing. According to Saldanha, he used that word 2013, Saldanha 2013. Now, back and forth is very important. And you can go back to your memo. You can go back wherever all the documents you have, just to ensure your field notes, interviews, just to ensure that your information is rich. Because listen, if you do not do that, and someone else, the consumers of your research, they can say here, there's something that is lacking down here, because it doesn't give me the impression that this researcher would have anything rich and deep in their analysis. So bracketing and all the others that you would have mentioned, memoing and so on, are important in the back and forth movement the back and forth movement of the researcher.
I agree with you. And I think although you zoned in on bracketing, I think reflexivity is critical as well at that point, because you're thinking, you're going back and forth between inductive and deductive reasoning. And I see memoing and journaling as important as well. But I know Mr. Williams, Mr. Williams, I want you to ask this question. I'm not going to read it out because it's a question you have asked me. And it's a question that you seem not to get anybody to give you an answer that would satisfy you. So Mr. Williams, go ahead.
Before Dr. Mr. Williams comes on, the flexivity and so on, remember that's going into the realm of reliability and the validity of our stuff and stuff. So maybe that could be dealt with in a subsequent thing, because I didn't want to bring so much information in the presentation so that less, we get confused. But that is key when we want to shore up the validity of our document. Yes, Mr. Williams.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Visasar, yes, this situation is very bothersome for me, and I keep asking this question time and time again, perhaps because I'm not getting an answer or a response that I can connect with. So I'm just seeking as many perspectives as I can get. Nonetheless, the question is, while you're coding, should one end up in a situation where a piece of text, a text segment, can be interpreted in more than one way, such that it forms a one-to-many mapping from that piece of text to different codes, different interpretations that are coded? And I'm speaking here in the context of a single researcher conducting their work.
Okay. Thank you so much. Very good question. And that is the key to qualitative research, not only grounded theory across the board, all the other approaches. Now, remember, when you go out there in the fields, each person that gives you a response, they are sharing that response from their reality. A second person you ask, they are that same question, they are sharing their response to that question from their reality. So you can ask 100 persons in this room the same question, and you have different responses. Why? Because in qualitative research, you have what we refer to as multiple realities. And that is something that is perfect because it is not objective, as in the other orientation, the quantitative orientation. It is more subjective. So the individual, the respondents are sharing their reality. And we just have to accept the reality. We cannot bracket or not. Don't let me use that word there. We cannot say, okay, 99 individuals said something different to this one, so I'm going to exclude because there's multiple. Now, there is also something called triangulation within our qualitative research. And that in itself leads to this multiple reality scenario. Triangulation in different forms, multiple people or multiple sources. Those are two of the ways we can engage in triangulation. So that is what you should welcome, these varying realities of the respondents. And you have to find a way, be so creative. And if you're doing a narrative or something, try and put that in some nice story form in your document. I don't know if I did justice, Mr. Williams. But the fact is, the scenario you're pointing out is persons, the respondents giving you so many different views.
No. No. The specific situation situation that I'm thinking about is where one single piece of text can be interpreted, depending on the lens through which you look at it. It can be interpreted in a different way. I can't come up with an example.
Okay.
It's not different stories being
one text
of the same inquiry. It's more like one answer or one response being interpreted differently. So you've got different codes that can be assigned to that one piece of text.
Great. That single text and interpreted by whom? You're the researcher. Interpreted by whom?
Sorry, yes, by the researcher.
By the researcher.
By a single researcher, yes.
Now, what you need to do in that scenario is do what we call member check-in now. Member check-in, because this is a single text. Probably an interview. You need to go back to this individual because you are reading this text, and maybe you need to do some bracketing of some of your biases in the text, and go back to this same individual who would have given you this single text and ask them here. This is my understanding of your text. Am I right? And let the respondent tell you if you are right or wrong, because you cannot bring your own interpretation into the single text. Because you're bracketing yourself and you're writing based on what the respondent would have said. So don't tell me, sorry, don't say no, different interpretations. I need to go back to that individual and say, my friend, I am confused. This is my interpretation of what you have said. and I give them interpretation A, I give them interpretation B, I give them interpretation C. Could you help me? So the only person in this scenario that can help you is the respondent, him or herself.
Okay, that makes sense.
Because many times I have found it myself by doing my dissertation. I had to go back to the individual or the group. I said, listen, I thought I understood what you said during the interview, but I am confused. And I am not going to sit there and write what I think they said. I went back, I found some time and I had to drive all the way back. And I said, my friend, I'm sorry about this, but I am confused. I am thinking this, I am thinking that. Am I correct? Am I on the right track? Yes or no? Or could you please explain it again for me? This is what I personally went through. That's why I could have told you that.
Okay.
I personally did that. And when the person said to me, I said, oh, I didn't see it that way. I thought it was blah, blah, blah. So that's the challenge we have as qualitative researchers. I don't know if I did any justice there, Mr. Williams, but I
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Thank you so much.
most welcome, man.
Dr. Brown, on that note,
Yes.
Would that be an example of triangulation with data triangulation within the qualitative methodology aspect? Because you have the findings and you go back now to verify the findings.
Okay. Verification is actually not, I wouldn't associate with triangulation. Verification is more member checking. You're checking with the member and to verify what the member has given to me. Something like that. The triangulation, you can have two types of triangulation where you have multiple researchers collecting information. So you have all of these individuals going out in the field, or you, the single researcher, not doing only interviews, not only doing observation, not only doing this, but you're taking a variety of data, you're using a variety of data sources to collect your information. That's also referred to as triangulation. And in document analysis, you have a whole heap, put it that way. Depends on your institution that you're in. At the school, you have different data down there. At a government organization, you have different data down there. So triangulation could be multiple people or multiple sources. Going back for verification is member checking. You're checking back with the member to verify whether what they have said align with your writing of what they would have said.
Thank you for that. And
Yes.
I must say, in my own
Hello.
study, I did have to do that as well, where I had to go back and do member checking to verify the findings. So thank you for that. Dr. Hines, I think you speak.
Yes. Yes.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm very delighted. Very good, Dr. Brown. Very good. But you've taken me back like half a century. Because I will gel more with Glaser and Strauss in the original thinking.
Yes, yes.
Also, you probably will know Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman, The Social Construction of Reality. And Eisner will call that multiplicative corroboration. The question, however, is that behind all of this methodology, there is a philosophy. So if you go into any one of the qualitative paradigms, you're using a philosophy that is different from the positivistic ones like the normal quantitative. And I think you when you answered the question a few minutes ago, you hit on it in that, how are you sure that you are interpreting correctly? What are the multiple meanings given to a statement made by a person? You go back to Clifford Geertz and all of these people, the original people in anthropology. I think that is the risk that qualitative work and grounded theory included will have. Now, if you go to the policymaker who wants to get $10 million from a development agency,
Mhm.
he or she will have to take a quantitative piece where you can make predictions, etc.
Mhm.
But to enrich the work, you can present a case where you can demonstrate what numbers cannot demonstrate in
Yes.
terms of how the process goes. I remember attending on behalf of UG, a Ministry of Education meeting. It was to do with loans and grants and so on. And apart from the quantitative pieces that were presented by the ministry, the World Bank person asked a single question: do you have evidence of how this process works? You see, we concentrate on the numbers.
Right.
So many people pass the exam and that, but how does the process go? And here's where I think that qualitative work is very important. As you mentioned earlier, generalizability is different in qualitative work from quantitative work. The question is, it takes a lot of time. And how would you recommend that this kind of process be undertaken by a student doing an MEd in 18 months, 2 years?
Thank you, Dr. Hines, for that tough question. 18 months for grounded theory research. Could I tell you how long I took to do my research? It's very time consuming. It depends on the supervision that is given, to the workload of the student. The student has other responsibilities, that may have family, they have work responsibility. In my case, probably more than 18 months, because I didn't want only to focus on one orientation. I wanted both of them in my single document, but it took me a pretty long time, and I hadn't all of that responsibility. And still I had crunch time. It was crunch towards my defenses, my preliminary defense and my final defense, very crunch. So a person in a MEd program who wants to do grounded theory, it is not impossible, but you have to decide, listen, certain things I can't do. I need to sit down behind my books and I need to be writing. Because to transcribe a single interview, it took me about 3 hours. Soon after the interview, I went into my car immediately and I started to write. My tape, I played my tape back and forth and I write. So it is not impossible, but it is this crunch time, Dr. Hines. It is not, and I know many of the MEd Pro students, they want to say, okay, I don't have enough time, let me do the quantitative thing. I just have the thing, I put it in the software, and bam, you have it. Yeah. But this method, this methodology is exciting, folks.
Yeah.
It is exciting. And I wish, I was speaking to some PhD students just last week, Tuesday, about the same thing. The professor, they wanted me to talk about the same grounded theory. And I said, listen, this is exciting stuff. Get involved. And you can see my passion. So MEd students, get involved. You can do it. I love it. You can love it too.
Yes.
Dr. Hyde.
Yes, thank you.
You're most welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Brown. I don't know if anybody has any other questions or comments. Mr. Williams, you wrote something that you want to share with us. Do you want me to get some backup music or something, Mr. Williams?
No, Dr. Cesar. That might embarrass me. I can't sing, but I'll post it in the chat at the moment.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else? Dr. Hines, thank you for your addition. It's always welcome. You're very expert.
But I think, Dr. Bisesa, I think this approach could be encouraged. But the point about it is that from the time the student enters the MEd program, the research methods course should be more inclusive, so to speak. And the candidate may end up not doing, let us say, grounded theory. It might be a narrative, it might be case studies. In other words, there are so many ways in which you could do it. You can do this kind of work, but I think the first thing you've got to get into your head is the ontological part that Dr. Brown mentioned. What is reality? And what do we mean by multiple realities? What justification do I have for accepting another person's reality? In doing the work, am I subconsciously or unconsciously changing that person's reality to my reality?
Yeah.
Good
and
point.
all of these things are possible. So it's one has to be very cautious. And as Dr. Brown has said, you really have to like it. But my interest is not mainly methodology, but the philosophy that underlies the whole thing. What is truth? Is there any truth? What is real? And what is real for me? Is it real for you? That's the part of the grounded theory that I like. Thank you.
I agree with you, Dr. Hines. And the other part of that whole reality is my interpretation of what you said, your reality or my reality, because I'm coming with my enculturation and all of that.
That's right.
So then which reality are we when we do the grounded theory? Yes, Dr. Brown went back and did member checking and stuff. But again, think of member checking. He's getting what they think, what they said, but then he's interpreting it. You understand?
Yeah.
So again, there's a level of subjectivity, and that is the issue with qualitative research. You cannot get away from that.
But there's nothing wrong with subjectivity.
Exactly. But to what extent?
Yes, and what are your boundaries, which you should state upfront.
And that's important. So, and you know what I think is good, and he mentioned it too, is having like other researchers. What I like too is the intra and intercoder reliability. So if you code it and you go back and you put it down for a month and you go back and code it, you might code it you might be in a different space when you recode it. Similarly, the intercoder reliability. If a group of you coded that and everybody coded and you collate that information, again, all of that is critical. So
and intercoder reliability are very important. It's like it's like what we call practicum. How do you know that what I'm seeing is what you're doing? So you don't try to see a person by yourself because you already have a bias. And all of these things come together in this kind of approach to philosophy about, again, what is reality? What are you seeing? Why do you rely on what you are seeing? Right? So,
exactly, and that's the whole concept of existentialism. If you talk about Sartre and Camus and all of them and their ideologies, you will see that the premise of existentialism is like that too.
Maybe at another presentation, we can look at all those philosophical things that impact the various approaches. Okay, the interpretive framework and the philosophical assumptions and all of those kind of stuff. How it impacts each of the approaches. You know, because what I find too, unless students understand that, we will continue to have the same problem that we're having. And one of the issues is the students having in mind, remember these students are oriented towards a quantity. We all know that. But when a research question comes to you, what happens? Do we force now that qualitative research question into, because the student is oriented that way? So hence the reason Dr. Hines would have made perfect, an excellent point there, where
Mhm.
is how the students are oriented. We are more, some of us, many of us are quantitative oriented. And it's the same systematic thing. Struss is more qualitative based on the school he attended. Okay, and Glazer is more quantitative. So they brought those two their orientation into this new approach, that kind of thing. So that is why it maintained its element of being systematic, a kind of scientific thing, because of their own personal training, how they were oriented. So we need to have a balance within our department, within the university, where students can be familiar with both quanti as well as quali. Because they want to do quali, they want to do quanti, but the research questions are more geared towards another orientation.
Yes, exactly. And again, as Dr. Hines, you said, you know, all our preconceived notions come into play here. Why it is you chose the topic you chose, that shows up a bias already, because you're passionate about that particular topic and that slant. So you're starting off on the premise of bias.
Well, Dr. Bisasa, what I think is this: at the MEd level, before students are assigned, it's a pity we don't have face-to-face. We have an open discussion. The students come and all the professors are there, and you talk about what you want to do and so on. And then a decision can be taken there, not a decision whether you're bound to do this, but a suggestion. It seems to me like you will do well in the area of a case study, because you seem to have that kind of a knack for interviewing people, for paying attention to detail and that kind of thing. Another person may want to do application to the entire education system or to a region and so on. And the best way to do that is by doing quantitative piece, because policymakers like to see numbers. When you go to ministers' meeting, when I worked in the OECS, you've got to go to that minister, with those ministers with numbers. If you tell them there's indiscipline in the schools, and they would ask you what percentage of the children, that's a simple one. And they will judge the severity of something or the goodness of something by the number, right? So that's why quantitative work, you know, is popular, so to speak. Qualitative work is rich, but we've got to somehow speak with students to say, well, look, why will you do this in a qualitative way? What are we learning? Because in the primary school, they're doing things like stories and plots and all of these kinds of things. And this is a deeper understanding of how human life works, of the interactions. What is society? Why is interaction so important? Why do people change? Why do people hold different views? And as early as the 1960s, Robert Dreeben did a lot of work in this in terms of the norms of schooling, followed by Philip Jackson and his work about schools also. So we have a lot of precedent. The point is, how do our students make a choice? What support are we giving to our students at the MEd level for them to make a choice that suits their particular personality, and they can work with a supervisor who is passionate about that, right? There is you know, we don't just assign by the U to go to A, you go to B, and so on. And if you do that, you may get a student who is very, very good, who likes this work. I remember some years ago, I was supervising a student in another Caribbean country, and she wanted to study two principals or head teachers, and whether they have different styles and what affected the style. And she went about 4 or 5 times. She said, but I'm not seeing anything different. I said, you're not looking. And suddenly one day she ran to me, they had different people. Yes, because she observed. It's something you've got to learn to do. It doesn't just come like that. It's not like asking a person a question. The brain has to be attuned to operate in that way. So it is a lot of encouragement, a lot of I'm asking or professional persons at UG. And it may be you can get assistance from a person who is in physics, or a person in medicine, or a person, say, doesn't have to be an education person coming up with an idea. Human minds are very fertile. And I think we should start to integrate. We talk about inclusivity, and the MEd program as such must have this sort of inclusivity so that we can provide the students with openings instead of setting down lots of rules and regulations. Openings. Right? In some universities, you can go to anybody on campus to get information about your research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hines. Do we have any other questions? Okay, Malcolm says he likes his lunch bag gaff, very enriching and natural. By the way, okay, sorry, was that for me alone? Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay, all right. So thank you everyone for being here, and thank you very much, Dr. Hines, for all your additional information and sharing your expert knowledge with us. Thank you very much, Dr. Brown, for this carefully thought out presentation that took into consideration the critical aspects of grounded theory. I do agree. I'm a bit concerned that the length of time taken to actually do the theory, and I know Dr. Hines raised that as well. So on that note, I know some people are eating. So on that note, enjoy the rest of the day, the rainy afternoon, and have a wonderful, productive, fruitful week ahead. And this is the last one for lecturers for this year, 2021. However, next week, we have one called Managing Stress and Anxiety for the students. And I will be, me or my personal assistant will be sending out a link to you all to attend if you wish. So thank you very much, and we will end the session now.
Thank you so very much for attending, and thank you for the opportunity as well, Dr. Professor. Thanks everyone for coming. Bye.
Can you stop the recording?